Hello, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference. The title of my presentation is a cross-disciplinary approach to Picasso's bilingual poetry. So I will be talking about an aspect of Picasso that has not been covered as extensively as his visual art, is the fact that he actually wrote poetry. Not many people know this, but he was actually a prolific writer. He wrote in both Spanish and French, and he also did a number of plays. So he wrote quite a bit. So this is the aspect of Picasso that I will be talking about, Picasso, the writer. Pablo Picasso started writing in 1935. The onset of this new endeavor is said to have coincided with the marital crisis, as well as the deteriorating socio-political situation in his home country, in Spain. After all, 1936 is the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. That would really tear up the country. This brought about a substantial decrease in his pictorial output, as expected. Writing now became his alternative outlet. My claim is that he resorted to writing as a venue to think through these problems. We're going to see that for Picasso, writing was actually primarily a thinking tool. The same thing can be said about his art. It's an art that is in process, that is constantly being developed, and that's the idea. It's not a finished product. It's an item in the making, and that's what Picasso's interested in. He had always been interested in writing. As early as 1893, when he was just 12 years old, Picasso had started to write a periodical, which he named Azul y Blanco. You see illustrations there. The following year, he started a second one that he called La Coruña. That's where he was living at the time, illustrated with portraits and caricatures. The fact that he dedicated them to his uncle Salvador Ruiz Picasso, a crucial supportive figure in his early artistic career, marks the importance these writings had for him. So these were not trivial items, that he actually paid a lot of attention to what he was doing. So writing was important to him from the very beginning. Then at age 20, during the brief stay in Madrid, he had also co-edited a new art and literary journal called Arte Joven with a friend from Esquadregat, the writer Francisco d'Assis Soler. And you can see illustrations there. So Picasso served as the illustrator and editor of this journal. So again, he collaborated with a number of writers, some very important writers from Spain. And so he was paying attention also to literary writing. In these early incursions into verbal expression, these early incursions into verbal expression show Picasso's proclivity for language. His interest in linguistic representation really came to fruition in 1911 during his so-called synthetic cubist period, as he started inserting strings of words into his compositions. We must remember that at this point in his life, he had already been exposed to 4 different languages: Spanish, Catalan, French, and Galician. So he was fluent in 3 of them. So to quote Marie-Laure Bernadac, Picasso became conscious of the ambivalence of language, the ambivalence of words. The papier collé could even be thought of as proverbs. It is unquestionable that his whole life he was obsessed with the relationship between painting and writing, and this is going to be very important to my presentation, how they relate to each other. The battle between words and images, as Bernadac said. It could be that as a speaker of different languages, he had a proclivity to find diverse ways to encode and access knowledge. So here we see an example on the left-hand side of the combination of text, basically script from newspapers, and added them to these collage of a bottle and as a still life. The interesting thing about these compositions is that the text in those articles, those newspaper articles, is important for the understanding of the composition. So you have to actually read them in order to understand exactly what's going on in it. So what is the relationship in Picasso between art and literature, between images and text? We're going to see that they're interrelated in Picasso. When we look at some of the manuscripts of Picasso, like this one, we can see that they can be fairly colorful. So he used different colors here: blue, red, green, yellow. He also uses all kinds of marks. You can see these hyphens, and then he uses brackets. So he used all kinds of different elements. And this kind of reminds us a little bit of illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. Here we see an example from 1450 from northern France. And you can see, again, they used decorations on the margins on the left-hand side. They're abstract decorations, very often floral. And you can see these kind of brackets or hyphens here on the margin. So basically the idea is to maintain the text as a block, as a graphic unit. You can see also the capital letters are sometimes introduced with these kind of graphic elements. So these illuminated manuscripts were, of course, text, but they were intended to be decorative elements that were supposed to be visual compositions. Here we see an example again from Arabic, an illuminated manuscript. And here we see also the example of keeping the text as a block, again, with graphic elements, abstract in this case, as you would expect in an Arabic text. And then you see some elements on the margins as well. And Picasso actually illustrated some of his manuscripts. So here you can see an illustration. So in this case, he uses images of nudes on the margins, or the skull of a bull at the bottom, a reclining nude at the top. So he surrounds his text with images. So he could decorate his manuscripts. But primarily what I'm going to be referring to is the graphic elements that he uses inside. You can see in the text itself, those blots, those hyphenations that Picasso uses. And what is the point? What is the point of those items? So here we see a very typical example of a manuscript by Picasso. Again, it doesn't use these referential elements. It doesn't have figures on the margins, but we can see that it's a very plastic script, right? So the letters are different sizes. The ink is used in different ways throughout the text. He used blots like here to mark, to delete or to block some of the elements. And then, in this case, we see also underlining in red. So the interconnection between writing and drawing was already noticed by Cowling in 2002. To quote her, "A glance at the manuscripts reveals that he was attentive to the look and layout of the pages, relishing the dramatic impact of such things as variations in the size and style of the script, changes in the flow of ink, contrasts between letters, numbers, dividing lines, and the special punctuation marks he favored, different systems of crossing out, and large blots of ink that we see there on the left-hand side." Nevertheless, while Picasso's poems constitute visual compositions, it's clearly the case that this is not just a text, but it's a graphic implementation of the text. The method he used in his writing is essentially linguistic in nature, although the manner in which he arranged his poems could very well derive from the lessons he learned from the Cubist collage. So I would like to mention some of the relationship between the way he composed his text and the way he did the collage. So here we see another example of a poem. We see the big hyphens, as you can see there at the top, start to separate the text. One of the poems were from the top to separate it from the bottom one. And then you see basically these kind of brackets inserted inside the text. So what's the point of that? So there's a certain systematicity to the insertion of these poems. So when we analyze the text, here's the Spanish text analyzed of this manuscript. So this is the one at the top, and here I have extracted the text. You can see that the phrases that are separated by hyphens are normally adjunct phrases, okay? And another thing that we notice is that, and I will explain what an adjunct phrase in a second, that these phrases are interrelated by referential indexes. So basically the first phrase there, recogiendo limosnas en su plato de oro, relates to the following one, vestido de jardín, and so on and so forth. And that in turn refers to the third phrase. So those phrases are basically left separated, but also interconnected through indexation. This is the translation of that same text in English. So to go again, what I just said, scooping up the handout of his golden plate is the first phrase, and that relates to the second one, in garden garb. here comes the bullfighter. So the bullfighter is referred to in garden garb. That's basically the clothes he's wearing. And the first phrase that is used is basically the action that bullfighter is performing. So you can see that even though they're separated, they're interrelated in the reference. They refer to the same individual. What are adjunct phrases? In syntactic theory, adjunct phrases are basically attached. One of the interesting things about adjuncts is that they're attached at different points in the tree. So in the sentential tree, in the structure. So one of the advantages of that is that it can be left floating. An adjunct can be left floating, as opposed to a complement that is normally restricted as to the position that it can take. Another advantage of adjuncts is that they can be reiterated. So you can have a number of adjuncts, whereas in complements, you normally have a certain restrictions of the number of complements that you can use. So it could be the possibility why he's using adjuncts, because they have this kind of floating nature. They can be added at random, and they provide additional information to the content of the phrase. Another interesting thing about these concatenations that I refer to, these indexal, the indexes that he uses to refer to the same items, kind of reminds us a little bit of the way he composed. So you can see here, these are abstract guitars that Picasso put together, and they're basically made up of lines interconnecting dots. So basically the interconnections that we find in the indexes in the poems can be referred to that same idea. So you have a poem interconnected, separated, items separated, but interconnected through these linking. So that relates to the graphic compositions. Now, the interconnection, the indexical chains that we see are metaphorical in nature. So basically, as here, I gave an example. So the poem that I'm analyzing actually refers to a bullfight. And so the first concept is the bull ring. There are different references to the bull ring. There are references to the bullfighter. There are references to some of the items that he carries. For example, a cape. To the action itself, to the bullfight, to the bull in the bullfight, and to the public, to the audience that is watching. So here, this is the same, but in English. So for example, the bull ring is referred to metaphorically as the gold plate, hourglass, sand, bull ring, pot, flags, roof. The bullfighter can be referred to as flower suit, bullfighter itself, stars, rainbow. The bull, for example, can be referred to as pincushion of screams because of the banderillas that the bullfighter puts on the bull, and so on and so forth. So they're basically metaphors, and they're metaphors that are interconnected. So there's, even though it seems to be open, there are restricted domains that Picasso sticks to in each of the poems. So phrases linked to each other in fluxion reversible attachments. That's what we see, these adjuncts interconnected with each other, intentionally left tentative and ambiguous, open to potential deletions and insertions as the poems undergo revisions. So we're going to see that Picasso constantly revises his poems, but that's why we see these blots and so on and so forth. Just as pieces of paper were precariously pinned and to the support in the Cubist papier-collé and were left open to the possibility of being removed. So basically what I'm suggesting is that the idea of having sentences left open, hanging, these adjunct phrases, relates to the way he did some of the collages during his synthetic cubist period. So you can see here a violin, but then you have these pieces of newspaper basically pinned to the surface of that, to the paper, and they're literally pinned. There's a pin, and so the idea is that you can leave them there or you can take them off. And if you take them off, you will have a different representation of the violin. But it's the idea of leaving it like a temporary, like open to the possibility of being seen in a different way. So collage insisted in the role of representation in the production of a new reality, as Cottington has emphasized. So for Picasso, the how of the representation assumes a dominance over the what that is being represented. His writing is the same way, and his visual compositions are used as thinking tools, both for the artist and for the viewer. So the viewer has to participate in the finishing, in the completion of these collages. The same thing can be said about his poems. There are poems that are left open for interpretation, so you can read it in multiple ways. Another interesting thing about these poems that we've seen is that there is a combination of multiple disciplines, right? So Picasso was writing, but at the same time, he was using graphic elements. And this is not surprising because Picasso was constantly crossing over from one media to the other. The crossover between media is actually the norm rather than the exception of Picasso. So not only was he a very prolific artist, but he used a wide range of media. So for example, of the 50,000 works of art that he produced, there are 2,000 paintings roughly, but there are also almost 1,500 sculptures. There are thousands of ceramics, engravings, lithographs, drawings. So Picasso was using different media throughout his life. So it is not surprising that when he came to writing, he was also combining the different media. So he was writing, but he was also painting at the same time. So we can say that Picasso was fundamentally a multidisciplinary artist. Very often his work in one language, in one form of expression, had a direct impact on another, whether he was working on it at the same time or as he approached it at a later date. So when he wrote and he used graphic elements, they were working together. They were actually feeding on each other. So we can say that Picasso's poetry is, I'm going to call it adjunctive poetry. And there is a relationship between collage, as I've mentioned. You can see examples there on the left-hand side, and the writing is also basically a collage with text. So what's the advantage of this multidisciplinary approach? Well, it has been demonstrated that multidisciplinary approaches enhance critical thinking. So you think more critically when you're using this multidisciplinary. It's primarily a cognitive focus, so it's a thinking process. It opens itself to adaptability. It enhances analysis and problem solving, communication, and so on and so forth. So it has been demonstrated scientifically that a multidisciplinary approach, as Picasso used, is the best way to have a more critical thinking. So it enhances thinking, as since I said, Picasso, when he wrote, and Picasso, when he painted, was basically using those two things as thinking tools. It makes sense for him to combine them. Okay, so let's explore a little bit further the interconnection between collage and adjunctive poetry. So for the purposes of illustration, I will discuss a poem, El que el silencio roba las florecitas, written in 1935. And one of the first things that one notices as one skims across the lines of the poems is the persistence of conjunctions, such as que, y, and de, which lose the causal or subordinating effect they have in conventional grammatical constructions. So basically, they serve as connectors. So in Picasso's case, we see that the different adjunct phrases interact with one another in the poem. So you see the repetition, que, del, que, de, so that is for that, and they're repeated constantly. So they serve as connectors, just like the hyphens we saw earlier. So the presence of numerous conjunctions is indicative of a very important feature of Picasso's poetry. His poetry is primarily conjunctive. They connect one phrase to another. As mentioned earlier, Picasso frequently made additions as he revised his poems, and in this case, also the added phrases are often conjunctive. So he added phrases, he interspersed some of these phrases also as adjuncts. In current syntactic theory, as I mentioned earlier, adjuncts are modifiers which really attach at a higher level in the sentence structure and provide contextual information pertaining to the nucleus of the phrase and its relation to both the complement and specifier. So all these adjuncts basically enhance the main sentence. They're purposely often placed at different levels, as you see in Picasso, or at the margins, as if they were footnoted afterthoughts. So this is a French version of this same poem. So this is the poem in Spanish. This is the French version of it. And Picasso inserted dashes. You can see them throughout here in the text. So basically they serve as pause in the thinking process. Again, Picasso was using this as a thinking tool. When one analyzes the position of the bracketed syntactic constituents in the poem, one notices that they're also, for the most part, adjunct phrases. So Picasso's labyrinthine writing works through paratactic relations between terms, resulting in semantic concatenations, as I showed earlier, that are held together and simultaneously separated by spatial metonymical juxtapositions. So basically they're linked, but they're kept separate, and that's the idea. So this is the French poem. As you can see, the items in yellow are an addition that he did later. So the original version would be in white, and then he had inserted items. These items that are inserted are primarily adjunct phrases. So you can read it with the insertion as is shown here on the screen, or you can read it without those insertions. And this is the example in English translation of that same text, but now just reading it without the insertion. So the silence notes, the flowerlets stuck in the little vase atop the triangles, the triangle that's wrapped around the onions, and so on and so forth. Okay. And here we can see, again, the presence of a lot of conjuncts and that repeat themselves and throughout the text in Spanish. So Picasso poetry is primarily bilingual poetry, okay, because he wrote in both Spanish and French. And that is itself interesting. Again, with the tools available to the online Picasso project, we have examined how Picasso used subtle oppositions between words within specific concepts in French and Spanish. So he didn't write in two languages just because. He actually, because his writing is primarily a thinking tool, he wanted to explore how the thinking works differently in the two languages. So the first question we can ask is whether Picasso covered different concepts depending on the language he used, and the answer is yes. So what we've done is we created a concordance of all the words that Picasso used in the two languages, in French and Spanish, and then we try to see the context in which they occurred, and we have found we have some interesting findings. So, for example, we observed that concepts like beat, break, and catch, among others, tend to be expressed in Spanish, where concepts like burn, carry, or raise, among others, are verbalized in French. So when Picasso wanted to express one thing, he used one language. When he wanted to use to express another thing, he used another language. We also discovered that French dominates in the semantic categories verb change, verb motion, etc., whereas in Spanish, it is predominant in noun event category. So again, there are differences in the conceptual and the semantic categories that Picasso approached when he used one language versus another. So we've done an analysis. This is still a work in progress, but it's interesting to see how Picasso used two different languages to express different concepts. So to illustrate further, Picasso used, for example, 4 words for the concept kill in French. So one refers more to knocking somebody down, to slitting somebody, to extinguish, to slay. So there are different manners of basically of killing, of executing somebody. Whereas in Spanish, Picasso stuck to only one, matar, which is basically to kill, plain. So he didn't distinguish the different manners of killing or slaying or getting rid of somebody. The opposite situation occurs with the word, with concept of anguish, where in Spanish we find 2 words. One is more passive, angustias, and another one is more active, acongoja. So here Picasso chose words that further specify the patient's role in the feelings, clearly demarcating the concept in its lexical implementation. However, in French, he used only one word for anguish. So is the opposite of what we see with the concept of kill. So again, he used the 2 different languages for different purposes. And this is one of the things that we found out. So what are the benefits of a bilingual, bicultural approach? There are many advantages that have been demonstrated in the literature. There are linguistic and cognitive beneficial outcomes for bilingual speakers, such as improved metalinguistic skills. So basically, they're more aware of the language when they use 2 different languages. They also are aware more of visual and spatial. They have more visual and spatial skills. And that's interesting when we look at Picasso. And very important, they improved creative thinking. So basically, because Picasso was using language, poetry as a thinking tool, it's interesting to see how the fact that he wrote in 2 languages is beneficial to that effect. Bilingual and bicultural individuals possess a set of interdisciplinary outcomes, such as higher levels of creativity, intercultural competence, and so on and so forth. So again, we see how Picasso using two languages are beneficial. People who switch more often between different cultural and social frames have more complex cultural representations. So using two languages or using two different disciplines, as we see in Picasso, enhances, it creates a more complex cultural representation. And that's what we see in Picasso. So his poetry is fairly complex. One wonders if it is the case because they were written into different languages. Other benefits: bilingualism is an experience that has significant consequences for cognitive performance, such as mental flexibility. And that's what we see in Picasso. There's basically that things can be seen from different angles, and creative and divergent thinking skills. Bilinguals may have a greater diversity of associations at the same concept and diverse ways of encoding and accessing knowledge. So that's what we see, that Picasso can approach concepts from two different angles using two different languages, Spanish and French. So for example, for the concept of kills, as we saw, or for the anguish concept, he can go to one language to look at it from one perspective, or he can go to the other for a different approach. Bilingual individuals have a higher sense of linguistic awareness and are more capable of switching to the appropriate register. So Picasso, it could be that Picasso was bilingual and bicultural, that he could go to different media depending on what he wanted to express. So he could use it with ceramics, he could do it with painting, with lithographs, with sculpture, and so on and so forth. So that also, and what we see also in his writing is the same thing. So the openness to diversity of bilingual and bicultural individuals allows them also a higher level of intercultural communication. And we know for a fact that Picasso collaborated with a number of people. He collaborated with sculptors, with poets, with different people working in ceramics, people working with lithographs, and so on and so forth. So the fact that he was bicultural, it allowed him to have interrelated personal relations with a number of people. So that's basically the point that I wanted to make about Picasso. His poetry is visual, but is also very much centered on language. So basically the fact that Picasso was bilingual, on the fact that he was multidisciplinary, allowed him to use language in his poetry that was a thinking tool, was an element to explore reality. Here are some of the references that I mentioned in my text. And again, I thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference. Thank you.